Alright, so in this video we're going to talk a little bit about using urine in the garden. So it might be a somewhat controversial issue and some people might be thrown off by that, but you're adding cow manure to your garden on a regular basis, and that is really disgusting. That's where a lot of diseases will actually be. Now, using urine in your garden can be done. You can use urine in your garden effectively. And there are some do's and don'ts to using urine in your garden. I have used urine in my garden, and sometimes occasionally I might consider doing it from time to time for a little boost to my plants. But in general, I don't usually use urine in the garden and on my plants, mainly because it does have a building effect in your soil. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So, urine in your garden is actually a very effective method to get quick, usable forms of nitrogen to your plant roots, and it really bumps your plants up. But you have to be really careful on how you apply and where you use it. For example, in your garden, like out here, that is no problem. You can use urine on a regular basis in your garden and water your plants pretty much daily if you wanted to out here, because it rains, there's bugs in the ground, and the soil is spread out, and you have the telluric currents that are in the ground, and all these things help break down and process waste matter in your garden. So out here it's a little bit different than when you're growing in pots. If you're going to use urine in potted plants, you have to be careful because there is a building effect that builds up in your soil if you overdo it too much. And the type of urine that you're actually using in there can actually become a bad thing. It can become a detriment to your garden. So let's talk about that a little bit. So normally when you're using urine in your garden, they say to use a 10-to-1 ratio. So that's basically 1 cup to every 10 cups of water you want to use urine. And they also say to not use urine any later than, I think it's 48 hours or something. It might even be 24 hours. I would tell you don't use anything other than about 6 hours old. 8 hours really kind of maximizing it. You want to use urine, if you're going to use it, you want to use it when it's absolutely fresh, because what happens is urine goes into a nitrogen cycle, and it starts converting over to ammonia 1, then ammonia 2, and it starts going into the nitrate cycle. And you don't want to use that in your garden per se when it's old. It has to complete its nitrogen cycle, and then once it does that, then you can probably use it as a fertilizer after it completes its nitrogen cycle. You just don't want to apply urine to plants where it's in the middle of that nitrogen cycle, because that actually becomes toxic to plants. After the nitrogen cycle, urine will be very potent, and it will burn your plants as stronger, if not, just as much, if not worse, than, say, Miracle Grow or some kind of artificial nitrogen source. So it can burn your plants after the nitrogen cycle, so you got to be really careful. Now, when urine is fresh, like 6 hours, 8 hours, it's pretty much fresh or right out fresh, as soon as it's made, urine is at its best usable form. It will not burn your plants. I don't recommend watering it straight, but I have experimented by, dousing plants with straight urine directly on plants that, like I got a lot of volunteers that come up, and I'll put it on that just to see what happens as experimental, purposes. And it didn't do anything to the plants, on plants that are out in the garden per se. But potted plants are a little bit different. I didn't try it with potted plants, but plants that are generally growing wild outside and all, I dumped it straight on there. It didn't do anything to the plant as far as harming it or anything like that. It might burn the leaves a little bit if it gets on the leaves, so it's very rich and might burn it, but fresh urine is generally not going to damage your plants, even if it's straight urine. So basically, what I would suggest as far as mixing ratios, I would say probably go with a 1:15 ratio, or like 1 cup to every 2 gallons, something like that, a little more. And you want to do it frequently when you water your plants. You want to use it in a frequent sense because it's very diluted and it's just enough to feed the plants, and yet you can use it all the time because urine is a daily thing. So you can apply it that way, but it has to be fresh urine. You do not want urine to sit around and begin to go into a nitrogen cycle. And once it gets into that ammonia state, you don't want to put that into your garden straight like that. It has to finish its cycle, or dump it in your compost pile or something like that, which is really good for composting because at that point it'll really fire up your compost pile. So you can do that if you want, but don't use older urine in your garden. Like I suggest, use a 1:15 ratio, or roughly 1 full cup to roughly around 2 gallons. Add a little Epsom salt to that and you're good to go. One of the downfalls to using urine is that, number one, it contains uric acid, which plants will utilize. They will actually use that uric acid. It builds the plant's immune system, and it also prevents insects from actually eating your plant because insects generally don't like uric acid. So when it gets into the stem of the plant, the insects will bite on your plants, and they'll take a few bites out of it and leave because they don't like the uric acid in the plant because it concentrates in the leaves and in the root systems. If you use it all the time. If it's just once in a while, it's not enough to do anything. But if you're using it all the time, you'll notice that you'll get much less insects feeding on your plants, except certain insects like maybe aphids or whiteflies or something like that. They tend to be, nothing really deters those. Those things really are a problem on many levels. But the other problem with urine is that urine contains, depending on your diet, of course, urine can contain a pretty good amount of salt in it. And if you're using urine on a regular basis and you're constantly fertilizing your garden with urine, especially in pots, because we're talking about that accumulative effect, the problem with using urine is that there is salt in your urine, and that salt will tend to start to build up in your soil. Now, the salt that passes through you when it comes out is already converted over through your kidneys, so it's like a very usable form of salt for your plants. But what your plants don't use becomes caustic in your soil eventually. So it will build up, and then your plants will start to show signs of salinity damage. So you have to be careful on how much urine you use, how much salt you're eating, and how you're applying it in your garden. You really got to watch your plants as you're applying urine if that's what you want to do. You really got to watch your plants and see how they're responding. If you're starting to notice some really bright colors coming out of the top, it's really starting to get like really light green at the very top, that's usually a sign that maybe you need to back off on the urine a little bit. Give it a break, give it just regular watering. Don't use any more nitrogen in there because it might be too much for the plant at its stage. And, when plants are younger, that might affect them a little bit more than a plant that's like this. These are fully developed plants. So you're generally not going to see, bright green tops coming off your tomato plants for example, when they're this big. Because they're already this big, the amount of urine that you're applying to each plant is so minimal. So it absorbs everything in the urine immediately. So it is fully usable. But again, just keep in mind that there is salt in the urine. But my opinion on using urine in your garden is perfectly fine. Don't use anybody else's urine. Only use your own urine if you want to, or your own family's urine, because you know where the urine is. There's no diseases. That's another thing too. Not that if you have like a disease, it's going to get into the plants per se, but if you don't want to use somebody else's urine, in general, just use your own urine or your own family's urine or stuff like that. That way you kind of know its source, and you're not worried about anything. You don't have to worry about any diseases. Now, urine, when it comes out, it's perfectly clean. It's the most sterile fluid coming out. When it first comes out, urine is perfectly sterile. There's no bacteria, there's no viruses, there's nothing in urine. Urine is probably one of the, not that I'm sticking up for urine or anything, but it's probably one of the cleanest substances out there. Probably cleaner, the urine that comes out of you is probably cleaner than your tap water, basically. That's why they have to put chlorine in tap water. With urine, there's no bacteria or anything. So now, yeah, if you have like a bacterial infection or a bladder infection or something like that, yeah, there might be some bacteria in there. But that usually, in most cases, urine is just generally sterile. So you don't have to worry about contaminating your plants with like disease that's coming out of you or something. So it's sterile. Just keep that in mind. It's the other stuff that you got to worry about. Now, like feces, for example, I wouldn't necessarily use feces in the garden. And the main reason for that is that, number one, I don't feel that it's good for your garden, per se, unless you fully compost it for about 3 or 4 years inside of a compost pile with other materials like wood bark and branches and stuff like that. I generally would advise you to pretty much stay away from, feces, using that. Though it can be used if used correctly. I don't personally, never even tried it. I have used urine around the garden, and it does work quite good if you do it correctly. Now, the other thing you want to keep in mind with urine as well is that, if you're taking antibiotics or you're taking drugs of some kind, heart medications, high blood pressure medications, cholesterol medications, these things are going to come out in your urine. And when you're watering them into your plants, they're going to end up in your plants. So if other people are going to be eating your vegetables and you are taking medications, you might want to consider that as a factor. If it's just you who's eating your tomatoes or peppers or whatever you're using your urine on, and you have medication in it, well, I wouldn't worry too much about it because it's just you. But in general, unless you have a very clean diet, like for example, my diet is very clean. I don't eat any artificial of anything. The only thing I consume are plant matter. I do eat meat once in a while. I drink distilled water, and I pretty much keep my body as clean as I can keep it. And if I use my urine, it's actually very good for my plants because there's no byproducts in my urine that's going to come out and contaminate my plants or my vegetables. But like I say, if you have medication, other people are going to be eating your vegetables and all, I don't recommend using your urine for that. Now, urine is a good alternative to using, say, Miracle Grow or something like that. Maybe you live in a remote area where you can't get fertilizer to fertilize your plants. Maybe potassium nitrate, you can't get your hands on any of that. So urine is a very good option to fertilize your plants in a remote location. It'll work perfectly fine. Your plants will thrive from it, and you can do that. You have that option to do that. But outside of that, the only real drawback to it is you got to be careful of the salt. If you have a lot of salt in your urine, you're going to want to be careful on how much you apply and how much you use in your garden. Because like I say, salt will begin to develop in your soil, and you'll begin to show signs of salinity damage to your plants. And you won't know why. You'll think, oh, this is blight, this is iron deficiency, this is chlorosis. And it turns out that it's because the salt in your urine is building up. And so keep that in mind. Now, should you do this? Do I recommend doing it? I recommend you experiment with it, and if you see how it works on one plant, and if you like the way it works, and you take all these things I just told you about into consideration, well, there wouldn't be any reason not to try it. Okay, so it would be good for you to at least experiment with and get yourself familiar with the possibilities of potentially using urine as a alternative fertilizer. As far as the other fecal matter or waste matter, I do not recommend using that unless you really know what you're doing and you know how to apply it and compost it down correctly and everything. All right? So this was just a quick video about urine and your garden and urine in your potted plants. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.